bear-proofing something, as you say, but not making it so bear-proof that the humans can't get in there. It is a challenge.
Welcome to Ascend Your Story, where we talk to people in science, tech and research from the Ascent Media Studio in the sunniest place on earth, Sunshine, in Melbourne's west, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I'm Sam O'Reilly, the director at Ascent Media, and after decades of filming, building radio studios and recording podcasts for others, it's super exciting to be here to bring the show to you. We've met many scientists, researchers and technologists on our shoots over the years who are doing amazing work, so we decided to create this podcast to help get their stories out there. Today, we've got someone who knows how to get their hands dirty. Our guest is Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at Deakin University in Melbourne. As a science communicator, he's educated millions of people and advocated for the conservation of wildlife across Australia and the world. On the ground, he plays a vital role in protecting threatened species, and at the highest levels, he pushes for strong policy to protect nature. Professor Euan Ritchie, welcome to Ascend Your Story.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Euan, this podcast is fairly serious, and we try not to talk a lot of shit. But
That's disappointing.
But today, I would actually like to talk shit with you, in particular, dingo shit. How does one end up looking at dingo poo for a day job?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as a mammalogist, we are obsessed with shit. So basically, we can learn a lot from looking at it. So shit happens and it can tell us a lot. So obviously we know that in Australia we have these big issues with livestock loss. There's a lot of controversy around dingoes, but also other species like feral cats and foxes and their impacts on native wildlife. They've been really devastating for a whole range of species. But by looking at what comes out of these animals, we can actually, of course, look at what animals they're eating, in what numbers, and then start to basically infer and think about what impact they might be having, whether it's on livestock or whether it's on native species. And recent work by a PhD student, Rachel Mason, in the Big Desert Wyperfeld region of northwest Victoria actually found that despite popular belief, only around 2% of the scats, so the crap basically from these dingoes, contained livestock in them, and about 7% was of foxes. So more than 3 times the amount was actually in foxes. And we know that foxes eat a lot of lambs as an example. So I think we're, of course, not denying that dingoes kill and sometimes don't even eat the livestock that occurs. Mm-hmm. But I think what it does show is that they're probably not eating livestock in the amounts that people might realise. And it's really, really important to remember that dingoes also perform really important roles in the landscape. So they're eating mostly, actually, it turns out, kangaroos and emus. And as much as we love kangaroos and emus as native animals, like any ecosystem, if their numbers become too high, then we can see impacts on the environment, so particularly from overgrazing. And in the case of kangaroos as well, of course, they can compete with livestock. So we're trying to find ways, of course, to accommodate things like dingoes in the landscape for their ecological benefits, but also their cultural values, which is really important for First Nations peoples especially, but of course minimise their impact on livestock.
So we met at the Little Desert Nature Lodge last year.
We did.
And I had the privilege of taking a lovely photo of you and 2 dingo pups.
Yes.
Which was, I got a photo of
it's all over my LinkedIn and everywhere else, so I can forever thank you for that photo.
I think that's what's connected us, that's those little pups. Now, you were there with a field trip for Deakin University. What were you there teaching them and what were they studying?
Yeah, so we were teaching our undergraduate students basically how to go about surveying wildlife, in a responsible and also scientific way. And so the Little Desert Nature Lodge is this wonderful place, again, in northwest Victoria, where it has a real diversity of species and also habitats. And so we take students up there each year to basically teach them how to survey, whether it be for birds or for mammals or for reptiles, and the various techniques that we use. And to basically show them, how to do this properly and really get hands-on. So you mentioned getting our hands dirty. That's something that we really pride ourselves on at Deakin, is that, you're not just learning in the lecture theatre, you're learning in the real world. And I don't think you actually can ever really be an ecologist until you get out there into the environment and learn how to actually basically survey animals, learn about animals, but again, in that really responsible and ethical way. So it's from my perspective, one of the things that I enjoy the most is actually seeing people's faces light up, when they, get a pygmy possum in their hand or see a bird that they really, really wanted to see in the environment and just see how excited they are. And you light that spark in them. And then they go on to basically sort of, have this passion for the environment and maybe pursue a career. So, yeah, it's absolutely the most rewarding part of my job.
Yeah, the pygmy possums were absolutely gorgeous.
They're hard to beat.
Yeah. And there was the silky mice as well.
Yep. Yeah.
What else? What other species were there?
Yeah, there was a whole range of reptile species up there as well. A lot of birds, obviously. So I think the great place about that environment is just how diverse it is, and we shouldn't forget the plants too, because I've got lots of friends and colleagues who work on plants, and so there's a lot of heathy environments up there. Really, really diverse area for plants too. So. I mean, it's a long list of species, but I think you mentioned the pygmy possums and the silky mice, and of course we even saw turtles and a whole range of other things around that environment. So I think one of the things also that you're probably aware of course, it's happened now is there's been a big fire that tragically went through that landscape and included burning the lodge. And I think obviously our sympathies go out to the people that were affected by that fire. I think the thing that will be interesting from an ecological perspective was also to see how that environment might bounce back. And we hope it bounces back. Of course, we're in the middle of a drought, so that's not helping things very much. But one of the things we'd really love to do is take the students back up there when we can, hoping, of course, that the Little Desert Nature Lodge can be rebuilt, which is, the local community is pushing for really, really hard. And we hope that happens.
So the lodge was completely destroyed, wasn't it?
Completely destroyed. Yeah, completely leveled to the ground.
And that was built in 60s, was it?
I think so. Yeah. So it was really a passion project. That originally the owner had a real passion for malleefowl and wanted to conserve that area for that really important species that lives in that region. But it built up to be something much more than that, and huge numbers of people went through that lodge. Whether it was just casual bird observers or university groups like us and others, so many people visited that place and love it. And I think, we're all hoping that it can be rebuilt.
So the fire destroyed the park and the lodge, and a lot of the fauna in the park. But the dingoes, they were in a pen, weren't they?
Yeah, look, it was a really tragic situation. So there was dingoes in an enclosure there that were for the Watchabollock people, and they were caring for those dingoes, or their name is Wilka in their language. And unfortunately, the fire, which was really, really intense, I think it moved more than 40 kilometres, in a few hours, which is a very, very quick fire,
And
very
it was
severe.
with no notice, yeah.
Yeah, very little notice and moving rapidly. And so basically they had to try and get in there as quickly as they could. And they managed to actually get some of those dingoes out of the enclosure before the fire came. But it just came so quickly that they had to themselves leave before they were in danger. And some of those dingoes were trapped inside that enclosure during the fire, which I can't imagine how horrific and horrible that must have been for the dingoes. Unfortunately, a couple of those dingoes perished in the fire, but remarkably, some of them also survived. And so one of them basically dug into the ground, one of the females, with her pups, which just goes to show how extraordinarily intelligent these animals are, the ability to sort of work out what to do so quickly. And what I heard was that basically when they went back to try and find whether there was any survivors, that they couldn't find a couple of individuals, and they were looking around in the enclosure. Then they realised that they're actually under the ground still, basically sitting this thing out. So just an extraordinary, a situation of survival by those dingoes. But yeah, my heart goes out to people at the Little Desert Nature Lodge, but particularly also, of course, the First Nations peoples that loved and cared for those Wilka so much. They're currently now being cared for at Melbourne Zoo, the ones that were hurt, and the some at Hillsville Sanctuary. I haven't actually followed up to see, what's happened since, but that's what happened to them after the fire. So they've been cared for properly. But yeah, look, a fairly traumatic experience.
Yeah, my my 3-year-old son would openly tell you that his dad's favourite animal is the dingo, and he says, "My favourite animal is the dingo too, and the koala too." I was like, okay, cool. You got a lot of favourite animals.
We can have multiple favourites. Nothing wrong with that.
Where does your love for the dingo come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One thing that was amazing for me was that when I first started my university degree at James Cook University in Townsville, Fresh face from Melbourne, moving up to far north Queensland, just almost a completely different place for me. I remember vividly, I think it was on the first or second night at the gatehouse at James Cook University. As I was driving through, there was literally a dingo at the gatehouse. So imagine, a Melbourne University or a Monash, and you're driving through the front and you see a dingo there. People would be like freaking out, like what's going on? In Townsville, that's just kind of normal because it's kind of this more remote place and you have a lot more wildlife in and around the campus. And so that was, I guess, my first connection basically with the dingo. But then in 2008, I was lucky enough to get a postdoctoral position studying dingoes. And that's really where my love of dingoes first started out. But to me, they're just the most amazing animal to work on for so many reasons, aside from sort of, their ecology and what their role is as a top predator in the environment. They also open up so many other conversations because they'd have to be the animal that evokes the most number of emotions I've ever seen for any animal in terms of controversies, so people love them, people hate them, and everything in between. They impact the livestock industry, but they also have really important cultural values of First Nations peoples. So everybody's got an opinion about dingoes, and we're still learning a lot about them. And I think they really help us to have big conversations too about the environment, about colonialism, about all these things that are really important and topical conversations of the day. So they open up all those kind of conversations. So look, I think they're just a fabulous animal, and I'll never get sick of working on them. And they're just beautiful. Like there's no disputing that. If you're out in the middle of the arid zone or even the alpine zone or even rainforest, they occur across a whole range of different environments and you're lucky enough to see one, it's a really, really wonderful experience.
You got the alpine dingo, which is more white, yeah?
Yeah, tending to be somewhat white, but they can also be really variable in the colour, even the alpine zone, but heavier. So if you see a dingo in the sort of the arid zone, they're typically around sort of 15 kilos or so, and they kind of, in some ways, look like a bit like a scrawny kelpie, right? That kind of classic build. Mm-hmm. If you see a dingo in the alpine zone, it's a much heavier set animal, and so upwards around 20 kilos. Mm-hmm. So quite a big difference in body size. And of course, they're heavier set because they need to be warm, right? They're living in areas where there's snow. So even though they're one species, there's a lot of variation in how dingoes look right across the Australian landscape.
So language is really important when we're talking about wildlife. Tell me about the use of language like wild dogs when describing dingoes.
Yeah, look, it's a really problematic and complex issue. So you'll often hear dingoes being referred to as wild dogs. And I think in the past, maybe that was done fairly innocently. People just sort of didn't really know that there were differences. And I think now, that there's a real problem associated with that term. So you'll often hear people use the word wild dog in a very sort of negative way. Wild dogs causing these issues and wild dogs doing that, and we should control wild dogs, et cetera, et cetera. But dingoes get lumped in with wild dogs. And there's been a lot of research that's been done recently by independent scientists and groups, genetic research, looking at dingo populations right across Australia. And what it shows is that the vast majority of animals out there are dingoes in a genetic sense. So they're not feral dogs. They're not even hybrids. So, in studies where they've looked at hundreds of individuals, it's very, very rare to find a true hybrid, which is a 50-50 cross, so a domestic dog and a dingo. They basically found that the vast majority of individuals were in fact dingoes. And so I think we need to be really honest about if we're killing, inverted commas, wild dogs to protect livestock, then we're killing dingoes, and we need to be honest about that. And I think, again, it's really, really important to recognise that, First Nations peoples take a lot of offence at, them being referred to as wild dogs, because in many cases they refer to dingoes as being kin, family. And so when they're being hurt, they feel like they're being hurt. And obviously that opens up really quite horrible conversations about how they've been treated themselves. So I think, we don't dispute the fact that, dingoes can have impacts on livestock. And occasionally there might be small numbers of feral dogs that do the same. But we should just be really clear about how we use our language. Of course, the public perceives things differently too. So that if you say to, I think, most people in the street, tell me what you think about dingoes, I think a lot of people would be quite positive about that. If you say, what do you think about wild dogs, I think you'd get a different response. And so people can manipulate that And I think we just need to be more honest about the language that we use.
So there are a lot of pests out there,
There are.
and we use poison baits to
Yeah.
to help with that. How does 1080 work with wild dogs and pests and dingoes?
Yeah, so we've had really devastating impacts, particularly by foxes and cats, on our native wildlife. And Australia has the worst record for conservation of mammals in the world in recent times. So around about 40 species have been driven to extinction in the last couple of hundred years in Australia. And a large number of those is because of cats and foxes. And so 1080, which is this chemical that's actually derived from native Australian plants that a lot of native animals have a tolerance to varying degrees, is actually very effective at killing pest animals, introduced animals like foxes. Unfortunately, it also kills dingoes. And so dingoes are either deliberately targeted with 1080 in some cases, or inadvertently will take a fox bait that will also still kill them. And so again, as a conservationist, I always sort of start with a position of let's do least harm. But sometimes we have to make hard choices as well about, if we don't control that cat or fox population, then a bilby or a numbat or something other, some other wildlife species may be at risk. We're, of course, moving towards trying to find more humane ways of controlling pest animals because from my own perspective, again, just because something's an introduced species or a pest species, it's not its fault per se. We, the humans, have done the damage. So we should be finding the most humane ways to control these animals. And there's really exciting science that's developing along those lines. So things like gene drive and so forth, where we actually manipulate the genetics of populations to, as an example, make them less able to breed. It's a far more humane way than targeting animals with poison. So 1080 is a fairly excruciating way to die. And I won't go into the details of that because it's really quite traumatic. So I think we're all trying to find ways to, manage pest animals better. We're also trying to find ways to maintain dingoes in the landscape, but not have livestock graziers being affected. And I think one of the most exciting approaches to that is using guardian animals. So, the Greeks and the Romans and others have been using guardian animals for a long, long time. So, hundreds of years. And so basically guardian animals, including large dog species. So some people might know the movie Oddball, a large white dog, a Maremma, is the breed of that animal. They're not only able to protect penguins, as in the case of that movie, they can protect livestock against dingoes. We also know that donkeys, believe it or not, can protect livestock too against dingoes. And so there's really interesting things going on in that area where people are taking feral donkeys, which we have a problem with in Australia. So there's really large feral donkey populations in northern and arid Australia, and rehoming some of those donkeys. And they're actually really effective at deterring, attacks by dingoes. So, and there's a whole science
That's
around
why I
that
love
too.
this show. Just finding out random
Exactly.
facts.
And who doesn't love donkeys, right? So there's a whole science around that too, that if you have too many donkeys, the donkeys just hang out with each other. So you have to have just the right number of donkeys. And then, many people, of course, would have seen alpacas in areas where there's sheep country, right around particularly southern Australia. They're very effective against foxes. They don't really work against dingoes. They're not big enough. But against foxes, they're very effective. So there are tools that we have to protect livestock, but in a way that I would argue is more ethical and still allows us to have things like dingoes in the landscape, which we want their benefits.
This is Ascend Your Story. I'm Sam O'Reilly, and I'm joined by Professor Euan Ritchie. Take us to the start. Where did your passion for nature spark?
I think my passion for nature probably started as a small boy, and I was very fortunate that my parents and family were quite supportive of my passion. So, my mum would literally stop on the side of the road and let me pick up dead birds and look at their feathers and their wings and so forth. And I suspect that not all parents are probably quite so keen to do that. I remember wading into, ponds and swamps with her up to my, my waist in mud, trying to find frogs and so forth. So I was really lucky that I had a family that supported my passion. I also spent a lot of time just outdoors, snorkeling, fishing, camping, and I just had this natural affinity and love of the environment. Conservation has been, I think, in my family for a long time. So, my great-grandfather and family actually were helped to establish the Mornington Peninsula National Park. So, a long time ago, that potentially would have had a road going through it, a bit like the Great Ocean Road. But there was a big push, and fortunately, they managed to say, "Look, let's just leave this special place and protect it as a national park." So, I guess you could say it's in the blood. But look, I've just had this natural affinity. I suspect that a lot of children have that natural affinity and connection with nature. It's just whether they're fortunate enough to have people to foster that connection.
Mm. And why academia and science?
So again, like a lot of ecologists and conservation scientists, I probably started out wanting to be a vet because I think that's what we're taught at school, that if you love animals, you'll be a vet. And then I worked out that one, I don't think I was going to be smart enough to get the marks to be a vet because it's really hard to get into a veterinary degree. But secondly, also I thought, look, I don't know if I just want to be spending the rest of my days, treating people's cats and dogs and the trauma
a lot of youth
associated with that. And full respect to all vets that do amazing work. I mean, obviously there's vets that are really lucky and get to work on wildlife and in zoos and so forth, and that's a small, proportion of vets, but absolute respect for them. But then I think, in high school when I realized that actually there's a whole, diverse array of jobs that you can have if you have a passion for nature. And I heard of this thing called an ecologist, and I thought, well, what's that? And then I realized that I could sort of pursue my passions through that. And I guess I was just stubborn enough to keep pushing with that. And here I am.
What do you think your younger self would think if you saw you now?
I hope he'd be happy. Yeah, look, I think if you're pursuing what you love, that's the way to live a good life, right? So, it's a challenging career being an ecologist and conservation biologist, especially in this day and age where we find ourselves in a climate crisis and an extinction crisis. But that also means that our jobs are really important. And also, it's a privilege. I get to go to these amazing places and have experiences like we did with the pygmy possum and, Little Desert Nature Lodge. So although there's really hard parts of my job, it's also an incredibly rewarding job. And I've seen wildlife in locations that many people just won't. I've seen bears in Romania in the middle of the forest, and I've seen beautiful green tree pythons in far northern Queensland and so forth. So I've been really, really lucky. So look, I'd like to think that my younger self would say, good job, keep going.
We were in Yosemite last year.
Yeah.
And my wife was getting very frustrated with me saying, "Where are the bears? I want to see the bears." Like, we don't want to see the bears. I'm like, "I want to see the bears."
We definitely want to see the bears.
It's the wrong time of year, unfortunately. But seeing all the bear safe bins, that was that was nice.
Yeah.
Just there's an overlap with how much they need to block out the bears, but also make it easy enough for people to be able to open them. And there's a bit of a
yeah,
bit of a
no, well,
grey
I've
area.
seen bear-proof bins supposedly in Romania that weren't actually bear-proof, like solid steel that they'd basically just peeled apart like it was a can with, some beans inside. They're powerful animals. So bear-proofing something, as you say, but not making it so bear-proof that the humans can't get in there, it is a challenge.
Now, you do a bit of it all, field work, deep research, policy, public speaking.
Yeah.
How did you pick up all these skills?
Just by opportunities and basically just having a go at things. So I definitely wasn't a natural science communicator, but I think like a lot of people, I realized that, science is really important, obviously, and we need to have the data and the evidence, et cetera, to make good decisions and to advocate for change and environmental policy and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that more and more papers alone is not going to change the world. We need to make scientific information accessible and we need to make it relevant to the people that we're speaking with. And so, I realized that actually if I wasn't investing a decent amount of my time trying to communicate science, then a lot of the hard work that we all do is actually not going to have that much impact. And unfortunately, we're trained in our degrees to be great scientists, but we're often not trained to be good communicators. And I think more and more that communication is really important. So it's just something that I've worked at for a long, long time. I'm actually a naturally introverted person. Some people might not realize that, but I am. And so I just had to sort of force my way out of that comfort zone, put myself out there. But it's a really important thing to do. And it's actually something that I now really enjoy, speaking about the environment and trying to sort of make people aware of just these wonderful wildlife and ecosystems and environment that we have, and also the opportunities that we have. That if we take better care of the environment, we can actually have all these benefits, whether it be our own health, whether it be the economy. There's just so many potential benefits in taking care of the environment. So it's something I'm really passionate about.
What does your day-to-day look like?
It's a real mixed bag. So it's obviously doing teaching. I teach, second year wildlife ecology, which is the trip that you came out with me. And so a bit of undergraduate teaching, but I also have graduate students, so PhD students, and also honours students that I'm supervising doing their own research. So there's data analysis, there's writing, there's a whole range of things. It's talking to the media, a lot of administration. So, I actually sat down one day and thought about all the different things that an academic does. Writer, data analysis, budgeting, mentor, it goes on and on and on. It's quite a mixed bag, but it's also why I love the job so much, because you're not really ever doing one thing. It can be hard sometimes because you feel like you're sort of being dragged in lots of different directions. So time management is a tricky thing, but I enjoy it.
And you've got a real passion for up-and-comers in conservation and ecology. What's it like working with people at the start of their careers?
Oh, I think it's just really inspiring, and it's also really important, I think, because I guess one of the great privileges when you reach my level, I'm a professor and I've got security, is helping others to foster them and on their own careers, and often also some of the best ideas and passion and so forth is from those young scientists, pushing the boundaries in a good way. It's just really wonderful and inspiring to be working with them. But I think, there's this really important, onus that we have as people that are somewhat further advanced in our careers to support others along the way. And so mentoring is something that I really, really enjoy. And I think it's vital that we all do it.
What was most important to you when you were early in your career?
Having people that basically, that I felt like supported me and supported my passion. So, I still have mentors that go right back to sort of, me as an honours student and an undergraduate that I occasionally touch in with. And so, I think that's just really important that people support you through your career. And I think in any industry, it's as much as, what you can do, but who you know. And so those networks and people that can open doors for you and open opportunities and support you at the right time, they're just so vital. And I think also just having people that understand that, every scientist, they're not all the same, different personalities, different needs, etc. We all need people to be sort of in our corner, cheering us on.
Who's been pivotal in your career?
Well, one person would be Professor Chris Johnson. So he was at James Cook University. Actually taught me as an undergraduate student, then went on to be an honours supervisor and a PhD supervisor. And he's now semi-retired, but he's still doing research down in Tasmania. Professor Andrew Bennett, who was at Deakin University when I first got there, so they've been really important mentors to me. But even also, I look to inspiration and get inspiration from my wife, who's a science communicator, actually at Melbourne University. So Dr. Jen Martin. So she's, she's a really important, inspiration to me too, even though she's my wife. Like she's inspired me, and she's a really, really wonderful science communicator as well. So there's a whole range of people that inspire me in different ways.
So nature and wildlife are such huge parts of First Nations history. What have you learned from First Nations communities in your work?
Gosh, that's a big question. I think, the really important lesson that I've learned from working with, Indigenous and First Nations peoples is just that the deep connection that they have with the environment, and they see themselves, of course, as being part of the environment, and as we all should. And really, therefore, the important role that we have in taking care of the environment. So, a long time in Western science and ecology, there was a sort of this weird notion that there was sort of the environment and people, as if people were somehow weirdly disconnected from the environment and not affected by it. Of course, we all know that's not true. Humans have been modifying the environment for thousands of years, deliberately so. And I think, this deep connection that First Nations peoples have with the environment is something that I've, really learnt from working with them in many cases on country, and something that I really, really, cherish and value. But there's so much more that we could learn. And I think, that's something that I would like to see more of. And it is changing, that there are a lot more First Nation scientists and First Nation scientists working with, Western science as well, bringing back, together the best of both worlds in terms of traditional ecological knowledge as well as Western knowledge. There's a lot to be gained there.
So the role of art and storytelling is another theme that comes up a lot in your advocacy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I remember, Tim Minchin talking about the fact that, again, there's been this weird disconnect between the arts and the sciences. And in some ways, that's a really kind of not particularly logical disconnect. Because when you think about art and science, they are both creative pursuits. So one is about expressing, understanding of the world and so forth through artistic mediums. The other is creating new knowledge, but it's still inherently a creative pursuit. And I think that when we can bring, the arts and creative areas together with science, we have this really powerful way that we can actually understand and communicate about the world. And again, the reality is that if we sort of talk in a really, dry scientific way, a lot of people are going to fall asleep really quickly. But if we can take that information, a lot of it's really exciting information, and convey that by using, all the various forms of art, that's a really powerful way to do that. And one of the, I guess, the proudest things for me in my career has been that, one night I was basically just banging on about how terrible the Australian environment was and that we need to do better in terms of environmental policy on Late Night Live with Phillip Adams when he was still running that show. And unbeknownst to me, Sarah Allen, who's a children's author and really accomplished artist, was listening, and she was writing books at the time as well, but not books about wildlife. And she actually changed her career path based on that conversation, and she told me that. And so she's now published, a book about birds, so busy beaks, jumping joeys, which is about mammals and ingenious insects, targeted at children, pardon me, but with really scientifically accurate information. And so, pardon me, I've formed this really important, connection with her, and she's gone on to do all these amazing things in terms of Australian wildlife. So I think that if we can forge these relationships between artists and creative people and scientists, we can, have these conversations in, I think, a far more powerful and effective way than we otherwise could if we're just doing it as a scientist.
This is why we've created this podcast, because working with Deakin University on photo shoots and meeting all these researchers and scientists and just hearing their stories, I'm like, I didn't know about this. I want to share these people's stories. So, thank you for coming on the show for sharing your story. Now, let's go back to some basics. Biodiversity. What does biodiversity mean?
Biodiversity is a really problematic term in many ways, because I think if you ask most people in the street what is biodiversity, a lot of people might glaze over and not really understand what it means. If you say nature, I think most people have a reasonably good understanding of that, and environment and so forth. So biodiversity really spans everything from basically sort of genetics, the diversity of genetics of individuals, of populations, right through to how many species are there, in the world. So, how many habitats, how many ecosystems, it's all of that. So it's a big thing. But it is a really problematic term, unfortunately, that I think a lot of people really don't understand what biodiversity is. But I guess the reality is that biodiversity is super important. So we know that, if we have, as an example, biodiverse crops, they're often more productive. They're less susceptible to pests and to crop damage and so forth. Same thing with ecosystems, of course. The more species there are in those ecosystems, the better they function. So I often use the analogy of a car engine. You have all these parts that are in your engine, they're working together. If you start tinkering with those parts, your car might still work, but it might not, or it might not function as well. And at some point, it might even just stop working and collapse. And so we want to maintain biodiversity in the environment for all the many benefits that it has, which again span all sorts of things, whether it be, health, whether it be agriculture, whether it be just pure enjoyment for people. People love being in nature. We know that there's science out there that shows us that people that spend more time in nature tend to have better health outcomes. People that have access to more nature, those areas have lower crime rates. There's all these benefits that we have from nature. So really biodiversity is just this term that we use to describe all that variation, right from the sort of cellular level in terms of our genetics, right through to the whole world, essentially.
You touched on ecosystems. What's an ecosystem?
Yeah, so an ecosystem again really is just the physical environment, so the soil, the surrounding habitat, the weather, etc., but all the species that also occur in that area. And an ecosystem can literally be tiny. It could be a fern that has water in it that small micro fauna are living in. It could be something as small as that, right up to the Antarctic ecosystem. So again, it's not a particularly well-defined term. It's relative to the area that you're talking about. But it's really, again, all those moving parts. And that's what ecology is. It's just interactions between species and their environment. So ecosystem is just a part of that.
Since science communication is a major part of your work, what's your approach to educating the community?
Yeah, so I think there's a whole range of ways that we need to speak and engage with communities. And, we've obviously got all these new mediums too, like social media. And so I think no one particular medium is better than another. It's about knowing who your audience is, who you're trying to have a conversation with, and then choosing your medium, based on that. So having face-to-face conversations, town hall meetings, going to community groups, that's still just as important as, being on social media and talking about issues, writing articles on websites, including places like The Conversation. There's a whole range of things. And then, of course, there's still traditional media, like radio and television. And I think the great thing that's happened, I guess, in the last couple of decades is that with the advent of things like social media, scientists have never had a better opportunity to communicate their work in real time and even to respond to issues. So if they see an issue that comes up, they can actually engage in conversations with people in real time. Whereas I'm old enough to remember that, in sort of the 1990s, basically your options were radio, television, newspaper. And often that was a slow process. Sometimes you'd be misquoted and you really couldn't do much about it. Now you can have control over that situation whenever you want to. So I think there's never been a greater opportunity for scientists to engage in science communication, and we should, take advantage of that.
Who are the science communicators you think are killing it right now?
Oh gosh, there's a whole range of people out there. I mean, I have a lot of time for Dr. Kylie Soanes, and she's at Melbourne Uni. She does a lot of work on TikTok, and TikTok is a space that I've not waded into, but I respect people that have. But she does really great videos about, urban ecology and how to make our cities more wildlife friendly. So that's a really great example. Dr. Vanessa Perotta, who's up in New South Wales, does a lot of work about whales and about marine environments. There's actually really a large number of people out there now communicating about their science and being really effective at doing that. So it's great to see.
So most of the population lives in cities, and major industries are often in conflict with nature. Are we being disconnected from the impacts we're having?
I think in some ways we are. I think we should always be thinking about the choices that we make, whether that's, what we eat, what we wear. Fast fashion is actually one of the biggest impacts on the environment. A lot of people are not aware of how we travel. All of those choices that we make as individuals impact the environment in some way. So I think it's really important when we think about the environmental challenges that we have to recognize that governments have a role to play, but so do we as individuals. I think another really important thing, though, to recognize is that cities themselves have a lot of wildlife in them. And there's often this idea that cities are sort of devoid of wildlife. We're lucky enough in Naarm, or Melbourne, as it's otherwise known, we have wonderful wildlife in the city. So we have, flying foxes that fly along the Eastern Freeway. So I play basketball on a Sunday night, and one of my favorite things is driving home and seeing literally thousands of flying foxes silhouetted against the orange apricot sky of the sunset. It's just gorgeous. Ricali, Australian water rats that swim around in our, creeks. You can actually see them down at St Kilda where the penguins are, that people go to see the penguins. The Ricali are there as well. Southern brown bandicoots, in and around the Cranbourne area. There's beautiful endangered marsupials. And then, of course, there's all these invertebrates as well that we have, orchids. Cities in some cases are the only places where some of these threatened species are left. So I think, again, there's a lot of work that we could do about educating people about the animals that they have in and around them. Because I think a lot of people have this idea that to see and engage with wildlife, they have to jump in the car and drive out into the bush somewhere. That's not actually true. And I guess one of the benefits, and there's very few benefits, but I guess one of the small benefits, well, not even small, a large benefit of when COVID happened, as horrible as it was that people actually were forced, obviously, to live in their local area. And we all had our 5K radius that we were sort of confined to and so forth. People started exploring their local patches. And in some cases, people just were blown away by all this wildlife that they had. So where I live, there's powerful owls that have been seen nearby, king parrots, and this is in the middle of the suburbs of Melbourne. So I think there's a lot of work that we could done to educate people, but also to think about design of cities as well. So, colleagues of mine, including Sarah Beckersey at RMIT, her group is looking at how we can design cities better to have more wildlife in them. So green infrastructure, so rather than having just concrete walls of all our buildings and so forth, building plants into those, building in like little small holes for bees or larger holes for birds and so forth. So animals can actually live in the infrastructure. And not only does that benefit the biodiversity, but in some cases, of course, it has really important effects like cooling. So we're in the middle of climate change crisis. Cities get hot, especially where there's lots of concrete and asphalt and so forth. If you have green roofs and so forth, that helps to cool it down. You spend less money on air conditioning. It's a win-win.
The corporate world tried to include some nature into some work. The Harry Potter experience out at the Briars wasn't really a great thing for the environment, was it?
No, look, I think unfortunately in the case of that, project, it wasn't well thought through, and there was a lot of people in the community that were very upset about the lack of consultation and how it was done. I don't think any of us are necessarily against having, outdoor displays about, things that people are really, really fascinated about, whether it be Harry Potter or something else. But it has to be done in an appropriate way that's not going to disadvantage wildlife. And unfortunately, the original proposal was going to be in an area where there are, threatened species, including powerful owls. They were going to have lots of, lights, sound going every night for basically weeks on end. And you can imagine the impact that has on animals. And so there's a whole large amount of research that's happening right around the world now to look at the impacts of things like artificial light and noise on wildlife. And we're finding out that, as an example, bats will change the way that they move through the night sky to avoid areas where there's too much light. Songbirds, frogs have to change their calls if they can, because they're actually just not being heard above the ambient noise of, all the cars and other things generating noise. So we need to find ways to enjoy the things that we enjoy, those outdoor activities, but not at the detriment of wildlife. And in that case, there were alternative places that could have occurred. And it was shifted, to the credit of the council finally, that they conceded that it was in the wrong place. But it took a long time, and it didn't have to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And they made it sound like it was their decision, and they thought this is a great idea to move it. More broadly, what needs to change in how humans interact with nature?
Yeah, I think there just needs to be a much greater recognition of just how important nature is to us. And I think that might sound like a relatively silly thing to say, but I honestly don't think people do realise how important nature is to us and all the many benefits that nature provides. And one of the most important is just inspiring people. Like it's just a simple fact. I can say personally, but I know lots of my friends, families, colleagues, that if you have a rough day or you're feeling, troubled by something, just literally going for a walk in a park or somewhere, it makes you feel better automatically. So there's just that benefit alone of having nature, but there's also the economic benefits, that, Great Barrier Reef, as an example, has been, valued at tens of billions of dollars, the Australian economy. And unfortunately, right now, of course, it's in real trouble with coral bleaching events due to climate change. And so I think another real issue that you often hear in the media is that people say it's the environment or jobs, or it's the environment or the economy, as if those two things are disconnected. And it's actually not true. So there's been a lot of research looking into this. And what it shows is that the more we invest in taking care of taking care of nature, the more it comes back to benefiting us in an economic sense, but all the other ways that we can't actually put a dollar value on. So I think a deeper appreciation of just how special this environment is and how dependent we are upon it is really, really important. And I think that comes back to communication. So getting kids in early, with books that they can understand about their own wildlife. Because one of the things, of course, in Australia is that we're in this extraordinary place where the vast majority of species that we have in Australia are found nowhere else on Earth, right? So we're really, really lucky, right? And there's people that come from all over the world to see that wildlife. But if you asked, an average Australian kid to name 20 Australian native mammals, I reckon they might get to sort of maybe 10 if they're lucky, the obvious ones like koalas and wombats and kangaroos. But it wouldn't go much beyond that. But if you ask them to name all the African animals they know, they'd name a lot. So there's a big role for education there, I think.
We've spoken about a lot of sad and depressing, challenges that we're going through at the moment. But where are we seeing progress?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to remember working in this, area that I do is to celebrate the wins, and there are wins, So as an example, I can remember that the northern hairy-nosed wombat was one of the most critically endangered animals in the world. It was less than 40 individuals in the 90s, and now it's over 400. And there's multiple populations now of the northern hairy-nosed wombat. So that was a species that was so close to being extinct, and we've now moved it away from the brink. There's really...
Has that been through zoos or...?
So that's just been through people managing the existing population, which was Epping Forest, and then, bit by bit, breeding their numbers up and then finding additional locations. Because, of course, if you have one species literally in one location, you've got all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And if you have one catastrophic event like a fire or something, you lose the lot. So it's just a lot of hard work and patience by the people, bit by bit, building that population up and then actually moving some individuals to establish new populations. But there's also people just doing really novel work as well. And so one of the cool things that I think about being an ecologist is just seeing some of the great ideas people come up with. And so as an example, there's a really small bird in Tasmania called the 40-spot pardalote. And it was being...
That is my favourite name of a bird.
It was being parasitized by this little fly that would basically attack the chicks in the nest. And the scientists thought, well, what do we do? How do we stop this? And what they ended up doing was taking chicken feathers, which you can just obviously buy, and then they doused them in an insecticide that would basically deter the flies. And then they measured the effect of nests that had access. So they put the feathers out in the landscape. The pardalotes would actually fly, take these feathers and sort of incorporate them in their nests. And they looked at whether those pardalotes would have higher reproductive success or not, that, if they had access to those feathers or not, and they did. So their effect of that fly went down. So another really cool example of a solution to a problem from the same research group was looking at swift parrots, which are a threatened species. And unfortunately, they're competing with hollows with, unfortunately, an introduced native animal that's become invasive in Tasmania, which is the sugar glider. And so they basically compete over the hollows. And in some cases, sugar gliders actually kill the young and then boot them out, boot the parents out, and then take over that hollow. But they've invented these nest boxes whereby they automatically open or close. And so at nighttime, when the gliders would arrive and cause all sorts of mayhem for the parrots, the box just closes and they can't get in. And the parrots are kept there safely overnight. And then when the sun comes out in the morning, it automatically opens. Parrots can go about their business and don't have to worry about the gliders. And so, there are these novel solutions that we have. And I think, again, going back to, science communicators who are getting out there on the TikTok and so forth, really conveying the message, I think there is hope. And I think we have to have hope if we're to confront these challenges. So we're seeing areas of habitat being increasingly conserved. And so there's this goal to have what's called 30 by 30. So 30% of the land and oceans under protection by the year 2030. So places like Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Bush Heritage, but also many Indigenous protected areas are increasing in the area being conserved. And all of that also contributes to conserving biodiversity. So there's lots of good things happening, and I think we just need more support of that.
You've spoken about how wildlife is adapting to increased droughts and fire and floods across our landscape. How can we help them adapt?
How can we help with fires and floods? I mean, of course, the most important thing we can do is tackle the climate crisis. So the reality is that if we continue down the path that we are with climate change, extreme events are going to become more common, and we're seeing that, of course. And the tragedy of what's happening in New South Wales right now with extreme flooding. We've had some pretty severe fires, including in the Little Desert area, the Grampians National Park, 2019-20 fires, which were some of the biggest fires ever seen for Australia, in fact, the world. So we absolutely have to tackle the underlying cause of that, which is increasing temperatures. And that, again, comes back to all of us. It comes back to us as individuals about the choices we make and about governments. And we both need to work together to tackle those challenges.
So people tend to be pigeonholed when they're on one side of a fence. But so like people think the farmers are only caring about their livestock and the bottom
That's right.
dollar. But a lot of farmers are ecologists in themselves.
Absolutely.
How can we work together with ecologists and agriculture?
Yeah, I think one of the big problems, and again, you see this a lot in the media, is that we like to put people into neat little boxes. So the graziers think this, and the scientists think this, First Nations people think this, as if they're sort of one group. And of course, even within those groups, they're very diverse. And so I think the more that we can stop trying to put people into neat little boxes and actually just become better listeners. So one of the things I always say to people when, giving classes about science communication is one of the most important things about being a communicator is being a listener. So if you're just talking at people, that's broadcasting, but you're not actually having a proper conversation with somebody. So one of the things that I actually spend a lot of time with, doing science communication is listening to people like graziers, like First Nations peoples who in some cases may agree with me, in other cases may not, but we have conversations. And in some cases that means that you can actually shift, the conversation in a more productive way. Graziers and farmers, I think, a really interesting group of people. Obviously, they produce food, which we're all dependent upon. And many people that go into those industries actually have a natural love and affinity of the environment, of animals. And many of them are doing their absolute best to actually try and, produce food in a sustainable way. And actually, some of the really most interesting conversations I've had have been with livestock graziers, including a friend of mine, Angus EMTT, who actually has now retired, but he ran a cattle property down southwest of Longreach. Before that, it was his dad's farm and it was sheep. As soon as he got hold of it, he got rid of all the sheep and put cattle on there. And one of the reasons he wanted to do that was so that he could have dingoes on his property, because he saw the benefits of dingoes in keeping things like kangaroo numbers lower, feral goats, feral pigs. Sheep and dingoes don't mix, but with cattle, it's a much easier situation. And so that's an example of where, a grazier, and he's still really outspoken. So he's on social media quite regularly talking about issues to do with dingoes as a former grazier, and set up a Facebook group, all dedicated towards knowledge about dingoes for graziers. So it just goes to show that, again, if we are prepared to listen to people and be open-minded about what people think and value, we can have much more productive conversations than just trying to put people into little boxes and saying, you think this and you think that, and everybody shouting at each other, which is obviously very unhelpful.
So we know you love nature. Where in the world would you like to, visit next?
Look, that's the great
or even
question.
settle.
I mean, settle far north Queensland, somewhere around the Atherton Tablelands would be amazing. I'd have to, of course, run that past my wife, Jen, to see whether she agrees with me or not. But that's an extraordinary place in terms of the amount of biodiversity in that area. Also, it's a relatively cool environment. So you're, a few hundred meters higher than Cairns, which is nearby too. So it's not quite as hot as you might think about normally in the tropics. In terms of places that I would love to visit, Antarctica is really high on the list, but I also sort of feel a bit uneasy about that. We know that it's a really fragile ecosystem. There's a huge amount of traffic that's already going down there in terms of tourists. And so there's this real conundrum there about, is this even a good idea? We're really worried about outbreaks of avian influenza. There's a lot of quarantine around that, potential for things to go wrong. So that's definitely a place that I'd love to visit, but I'm not sure whether I would or not. And I think another place that I would really love to go to would be the African savannas, because much of my scientific career I spent in Northern Australia's tropical savannas, including my PhD research. And Australia's tropical savannas are the largest, most intact tropical savannas in the world. But I've never been to the African continent. And I would just love to experience those savannas over there and just sort of see some of the similarities, but also the differences between Australian savannas and the African savannas.
So on a positive note, your love for nature and wildlife really shines through everything you make. And around the last Olympics, you wrote about the impressive feats of the animal kingdom.
Yeah.
What are some of your favourites?
Oh, I mean, kangaroos are hard to beat. I think as an all-round performer, some of the large kangaroos can move at more than 60 kilometres an hour and roughly 10 metres in a single bound.
And they inspire Australian breakdancers.
Absolutely, exactly. So I think, they're a pretty hard one to beat, I think, the kangaroo. But, we have so many extraordinary animals in Australia in terms of wildlife feats, Of course, even small insects like dung beetles that can push huge, balls of dung that they need to basically help raise their young, which are many, many times heavier than them. And that's a pretty extraordinary feat. But it's pretty hard to go past the kangaroo, I think.
So how high can the kangaroo jump? Was it 3 metres?
Yeah, I think like 3 metres straight up. It's they're just extraordinary animals when you think about it. They have all those sort of physical abilities. And then you think about, the mothers that can have 3 different young at the same time. So you've got, one in the pouch, one that's just outside, and then one that's basically a fertilized embryo that's been basically put into a state of pause until conditions are right. So when the joey leaves the pouch, and if conditions are right, that fertilized embryo will then develop into another joey. And they can produce different milk from different teats depending on how old that individual, that young is. So there's just so much about kangaroos that blow my mind. They're extraordinary animals.
That's phenomenal. Something I've been trying to teach my son is that that kangaroos aren't the only animal, the baby animal that's called a joey.
Yes, that's right.
And I'm like, oh, so what's this? And he goes, oh, it's a baby koala. I'm like, it's a joey.
Yep.
And he's like, well, what's this? Oh, it's baby possum. Oh, it's also a joey.
Yeah.
It's funny that kangaroos have been the one that have.
Yeah, they got in early and took it.
They got. Now, what's your feeling for the future?
Oh, look, I think we have to be positive about the future. Look, it's obviously goes without saying we're facing enormous challenges, but I do take inspiration from the many wonderful people out there, community groups, school children, scientists, all doing wonderful things to help basically conserve the environment. And I think I would recommend to anyone that if you are passionate about the environment, pursue that. There's that adage, of course, that if you do what you love, you don't work a day in your life. I'd hate to think that someone would sort of choose not to pursue a career in an environment because they don't see that as sort of a fulfilling career and one that's possible for them. It's hard work, absolutely. But I think if you've got that passion, you're needed more than ever. And I am hopeful that, I think we are going to turn around. It's not happening as fast as we would like, but I think there are a lot of people out there coming to realize that we have to take much better care of the environment. And it's a huge opportunity more than anything else. It's this massive opportunity staring us in the face that's going to have so many benefits if we do that.
I think the kids are a lot more aware.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
What's coming up for you?
What's coming up for me? I mean, I guess for me, I'm just continuing to do research a lot with First Nations peoples, particularly on issues related with dingoes, and I'm really passionate about that. I'll continue basically being an advocate for the environment and engaging in science communication. So, I don't have any particular massive grand plan in the near future, but I think one of the things that more senior in my career and advanced in my career, one of the things I've actually investing a lot more now is trying to actually help and mentor others. And rather than spending a lot of my time, publishing more scientific papers, which is a really important exercise as a scientist, is actually trying to invest in others. And I think that's an important role, I guess, as you move through your career. And I think that's probably the same for any industry, really, that as you sort of reach that middle stage, if you like, moving into the latter stages of your career, you probably reflect upon how can I have an impact on people and help, encourage others and bring people through.
Where can people find more about your work?
There's a whole range of ways. Obviously, you can just find me by Googling, Euan Ritchie at Deakin University. You'll find me there. You'll find me on The Conversation, the platform that publishes lots of articles from experts. I'm in the Biodiversity Council. I'm on Blue Sky, LinkedIn. You can find me in a whole range of ways.
And you've got your own website, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so just euanritchie.org. Yeah.
There you go. Well, Professor Euan Ritchie, thanks for joining us today to Ascend Your Story.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to the Ascent Media team for putting the show together. Jonathan Brown, Michael Nguyen, and Nico Scott. I'm Sam O'Reilly. Ascend Your Story is an Ascent Media production. We tell the stories of amazing people in science, tech, research, and more through video, photography, live streaming, and podcasts like this one. You can see our work and check out all the other episodes at ascentmedia.com.au.